Hello, friends. Are you watching this alone or with someone? Tell me in the comments.
Mom raised her glass with the elegance of a woman who had spent decades perfecting the role of the doting, classy matriarch. Her diamond bracelet catching the chandelier light just right, and with that familiar syrupy tone that always somehow managed to feel like both praise and a warning, she said, "To the daughter who never let me down." And as the room erupted in warm applause, clinks of glasses and faint gasps of approval, I felt my stomach turn in that quiet, familiar way I'd learned to ignore since childhood. My sister Emily, sitting directly across from me in that smug, off-the-shoulder cocktail dress that probably cost more than my entire week's paycheck, tilted her head and smiled like someone had just handed her a trophy she always knew was hers to begin with. Her wine glass was already halfway to her lips when I calmly reached into my purse, pulled out the folded envelope, and passed it across the table to our mother, watching her manicured fingers hesitate just a moment too long before accepting it. "Interesting," I said, keeping my voice low enough to make them lean in. "Because the IRS just sent that. For your perfect one." You could have heard a pin drop in that room if it weren't for the low hum of a waiter whispering something into his earpiece in the corner, probably alerting someone to the possibility of drama. And to be honest, I wouldn't have blamed him. I didn't even have to look at Emily to know her expression had shifted. For a woman who made a career out of pretending things didn't rattle her, she was suddenly quiet in a way that made me think maybe I'd finally hit something she couldn't deflect with a casual laugh or a sarcastic remark about my therapist's obsession with boundaries. Mom, on the other hand, slowly opened the envelope like it was a letter from the Vatican, her mouth twitching slightly as she skimmed the contents, an official IRS letter addressed to Emily, regarding a significant discrepancy in reported income, gifts that hadn't been declared, and a pending audit that had enough red flags to make any accountant sweat. For the past 20 years, I've played second fiddle in a two-woman show where one actress always got the spotlight, the praise, and the benefit of every doubt, while I was left in the wings holding a clipboard of everyone's emotional baggage. Emily, with her flawless resume, her designer heels, and that Instagram-filtered life of curated brunches, business trips, and hashtag blessed captions, had built an image so impenetrable that even Mom had come to treat her like royalty, and the rest of us like loyal subjects. I, on the other hand, had made peace with the fact that I was the practical one, the one who listened more than I spoke, who made space rather than demanded it, and who, despite working 2 jobs and raising a son who didn't even call her mom most days, was never quite enough. As Mom's eyes darted across the document, her carefully constructed smile faltered, and she looked up, not at Emily, but at me, with a mixture of confusion, fear, and something else, something dangerously close to realization. Emily, catching the shift in tone, finally leaned forward, her voice slightly higher pitched than usual, and said, "This is ridiculous. Kelly, are you really doing this? Here?" The here was loaded. Here at Mom's birthday. Here in front of Dad's golf buddies. Here where appearances were currency and shame was a luxury none of us could afford. I didn't say anything. I just looked at Mom and waited. Emily reached for her wine again, her hand visibly trembling now, and muttered something about misfiling taxes, trying to laugh it off like this was all some clerical error that would blow over by Monday. But Mom didn't laugh. She didn't say anything. And the silence that settled in her pause was louder than any accusation I could have made. The truth is, I hadn't even planned to hand over that letter tonight. I found it last week when I stopped by Emily's place to drop off a casserole. Yes, I still do things like that, even for people who treat me like a supporting character in their success story. She wasn't home, and her cleaning lady, who somehow knew me by name, but not by role, let me in. The envelope was sitting on the kitchen island, unsealed, like someone had opened it and forgotten to hide the evidence. I debated for a full day whether to take it. In the end, I did. Not because I wanted to destroy her, but because I needed someone, anyone, to finally see her for what she really was. The party started to shift after that. You know that feeling when you're watching someone trip, and there's a second where they might catch themselves, but deep down, you know they won't. That's what it felt like. Conversation slowed. Aunt Marcy stopped passing her phone around with pictures of her latest cruise. Even Dad, who hadn't looked up from his whiskey glass all night, finally raised his eyes. Emily kept smiling, but now it looked painful. And Mom folded the letter slowly and placed it in her lap without a word, her hand smoothing the silk napkin next to her plate like she needed something solid to hold on to. I knew then that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Emily wasn't going to roll over. Not her. She would find a way to spin this, to turn the room back in her favor. And Mom would have to choose. Not between two daughters, between illusion and truth. And that more than anything terrified me, because I had just shattered the illusion and the truth. The truth was going to cost us all. After the letter had made its rounds in Mom's trembling hands, and the applause had turned into the kind of awkward shuffling people do when they don't know if they should pretend not to notice or flee the scene entirely. The room, once filled with the warm glow of celebration and soft piano music, fell into a kind of subdued chaos that only those closest to the family truly understood. I didn't look at Emily immediately because I didn't need to. Her silence spoke louder than anything she could have mustered in that moment, and I knew her well enough to know that behind her blank stare, gears were turning at full speed, crafting the next version of her story that could allow her to slither through this without taking a direct hit. Mom hadn't said a word since folding the letter and placing it under her dinner plate as though hiding it would somehow contain the damage. And Dad, bless him, was already pretending he hadn't seen a thing, swirling his drink in that heavy crystal glass, like maybe the bottom held a better version of reality. As the guests began to peel off in pairs, some offering half-hearted goodbyes, others avoiding eye contact altogether, I could feel the tension thickening around our table, the way humidity clings to your skin right before a thunderstorm. Aunt Marcy leaned in and whispered something to Mom that I didn't catch, but judging by the look on her face, it was probably something along the lines of, "Handle this before it becomes gossip," which of course was both too late and wishful thinking. People talk, especially in a place like this where image is everything, and one cracked veneer becomes the dinner topic of every golf cart ride for the next 6 months. Emily finally broke the silence, not with an apology or even a denial, but with that perfectly calculated sigh she uses when she wants to position herself as the victim of yet another unfair attack. "This is so dramatic, Kelly," she said, her voice pitched just enough to sound wounded, but not enough to invite actual sympathy. "I don't know what you think this proves, but if you brought that here tonight just to humiliate me, congratulations, I hope it was worth it." I didn't respond right away, not because I didn't have 100 things to say, but because I wanted her to stew in the discomfort of a moment she didn't control. She hated silence when she wasn't the one causing it. I eventually leaned in, resting my elbow on the table and speaking just loud enough for Mom to hear. "I didn't bring it to humiliate you, Emily. I brought it because every year we sit here and pretend you're flawless while I'm treated like the family disappointment. And I'm tired of pretending." The truth was, I had been tired for a long time. Tired of showing up for birthday parties and holiday dinners where my achievements were met with polite nods, while Emily's minor victories were celebrated like Olympic gold. Tired of Mom calling her first when anything happened, even though Emily rarely picked up and I was the one who actually showed up when things got hard. Tired of the fake smiles and the constant, exhausting charade. Emily opened her mouth to respond, but Mom finally held up a hand, the same way she used to when we were kids and fighting in the back seat, and the gesture, though soft, silenced us both. "Not here," she said, her voice low and strained. "Not now." And just like that, the conversation was over, or at least postponed. Later that night, after the guests were gone and the catering staff was clearing plates, while trying not to make eye contact with the wreckage, I found myself alone on the back patio, nursing a flat glass of wine and trying to make sense of what came next. I didn't feel vindicated, not really. I felt exposed, like I had opened a door that could never be shut again, and even though I knew the truth had needed air, I hadn't expected it to sting so much. I heard the sliding door creak behind me and turned to find Emily stepping out. now barefoot and holding her heels like the party had long since ended for her too. "You really think I'm some villain, don't you?" she said, her voice quieter now, more honest. "You think this makes you better than me?" I looked at her, really looked at her, and for a split second I saw the cracks, real ones, not the carefully constructed ones she used when she wanted pity. "No," I said finally. "I think it makes me tired of pretending I'm worse." She didn't say anything else. She stood there for a minute, looking out into the dark yard, and then walked back inside without another word. I stayed out there a while, sipping what was left of my wine and listening to the faint hum of crickets, the kind of silence that settles in after something has broken, but no one's picked up the pieces yet. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. I didn't know how Mom would react once the shock wore off, or what Emily's next move would be, but I did know one thing: the game had changed. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't playing by their rules anymore. What I didn't realize then, as the patio door clicked shut and I was left alone with my thoughts, was that the letter wasn't the whole story, not by a long shot. Because buried in the details of that IRS notice, in the fine print I hadn't yet fully read, was something far more dangerous than unpaid taxes. And someone I hadn't even considered, was about to use it in a way none of us could have seen coming. The days that followed the birthday party were coated in the kind of tense silence that didn't come from lack of words, but from too many unspoken ones suspended in the air like smoke after a fire. Thick, suffocating, and impossible to ignore, even when everyone pretended they didn't smell it. It was the kind of silence that followed you into every room, sat beside you at the breakfast table, lingered behind every voicemail, and made every casual conversation feel like a trap waiting to be sprung. And yet, despite everything, Mom never called me to talk about the letter or the fallout that had turned her big evening into something none of us would ever forget, for the reasons she'd hoped. Instead, she called once to ask if I could bring her some soup from that deli she liked downtown. And when I arrived, she acted like everything was just slightly off, not shattered beyond repair. I should have expected that kind of behavior from her. That was always her way. Pretend nothing was burning, even as the walls turned black with smoke, and just open another window for air. But what took me off guard wasn't Mom's denial. It was Emily's silence. I hadn't heard a word from her since that night on the patio, and that made me more nervous than any angry voicemail or passive-aggressive text ever could. Because Emily wasn't the type to retreat quietly, unless she was planning something. And I knew her well enough to know that losing face in front of a room full of people, especially Mom's people, wasn't something she could simply swallow without choking. I started rereading the IRS letter one night after work, once the house was quiet, and the only sound was the low buzz of the fridge cycling on. I sat on my couch in my old sweats with a half-eaten sandwich beside me, and a growing sense that I had only seen the surface of something deeper. The notice mentioned not only unreported gifts and suspiciously timed charitable deductions, but also a string of flagged transactions, large, inconsistent deposits that didn't align with her listed income. I thought about her Instagram posts, vacation shots in Santorini, luxury bags that changed every few months, spa days in places that didn't even have websites because their clientele didn't ask for menus. And something didn't add up. Emily had always made good money, sure, but not that kind of money. The next morning, after dropping off files at work, I called in a favor from a friend I'd gone to college with, someone who worked at a private financial investigations firm, someone I hadn't spoken to in years, but who owed me one for reasons I didn't have time to revisit. I told him I had a hypothetical situation involving a family member, and before I finished explaining, he sighed and said, "It's always family." He agreed to look into it quietly, promising to keep things off the books for now. I told myself it was just to understand what I was looking at, not to dig dirt. But I think deep down, I already knew. I wasn't looking for peace. I was looking for leverage. A few days later, he called me back, and his voice didn't carry the usual casual tone I remembered from our college days. He said, "Kelly, I don't know how deep you want to go with this, but what I've found already isn't good." According to him, the IRS wasn't the only one interested in Emily's finances. There was a flagged connection to a luxury concierge company that had been under investigation for laundering money through high-end purchases, art, jewelry, even vacation packages. And while there was no direct evidence tying her to the operation, her name had popped up in several overlapping transactions. That's when I felt the ground shift beneath me, not in fear, but in the sudden realization that Emily's golden image wasn't just a mask. It was a shield, and behind it was something much darker than I had ever imagined. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed thinking about all the times I had envied her, hated her, resented the way she could walk into a room and make everyone want to believe in her. I remembered the way she used to look at me when we were kids, like I was a step behind, not quite smart enough, not polished enough. But now I understood that she wasn't just lucky or charming or good at playing the part. She was playing a different game altogether, one where the stakes were higher and the consequences real. I decided not to confront her immediately. Instead, I printed everything my friend had sent me, tucked it into a new envelope, and kept it in the drawer next to my bed. I told myself I'd use it only if I had to, but the truth was I didn't know what had to meant anymore. The lines had blurred. I was no longer just the underappreciated sister with a chip on her shoulder. I had information, and information, as Emily once told me during one of her rare, honest moments, isn't just power, it's protection. 3 days later, I received a text from an unknown number. It said, "You don't know what you're getting into. Stop digging." No signature, no follow-up, just that. I stared at the screen, heart thudding, and for the first time since the party, I felt something close to fear, not for myself, but for what this meant. Emily wasn't alone in whatever she'd gotten involved in, and someone else had noticed me stepping into it. But instead of pulling back, I did the one thing I knew would set everything in motion. I printed the text, added it to the folder in my drawer, and made an extra copy. I wasn't backing down, not now. Not when the perfect daughter was standing on a house of cards that was finally beginning to shake. The morning I walked into Mom's house to find her sitting at the kitchen table with the IRS letter laid out like some cursed artifact she'd only just found the courage to examine, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and dread wash over me. The kind that hits you when you win a fight, but realize you've bruised more than just the opponent. The kitchen smelled like burnt toast and lemon-scented cleaning spray, and Mom, still in her robe with her hair unbrushed and her coffee untouched, looked like someone who'd just learned her house had been built on sand. She didn't greet me the way she usually did, with a peck on the cheek or a half-hearted comment about my hair. Instead, she gestured to the chair across from her, like this was a formal meeting and not a moment between a mother and daughter standing on opposite sides of something neither of them could quite name yet. "I talked to Emily," she said after a long pause, her voice softer than I'd expected, but with that underlying steel that had always been part of her when she needed it. "She says this is all a mistake." I didn't flinch, not because I wasn't expecting it, but because I'd rehearsed this conversation in my head so many times that my emotional reactions had been dulled by repetition. I told her calmly that I didn't care what Emily said, and that I had more than a letter. I had information, real information, and it wasn't just about taxes or unreported income, but about associations that could ruin not just her, but all of us if things got out of hand. I slid a folder across the table, copies of the documents, the bank activity summaries, and the text message from the anonymous number, and watched as Mom's hands trembled ever so slightly when she opened it. She read slowly, her brow furrowing with every new page, and when she looked up, her face was a pale mask of disbelief. "How long have you known?" she asked. And that question hit harder than I expected, because it wasn't really about timelines. It was about trust, about the fact that for the first time, I'd taken control of a narrative she thought she knew better than anyone. I told her the truth. Only recently, but long enough to understand that what we were dealing with wasn't just Emily being careless. It was deliberate, and it had been going on for a while. That was when the phone rang, her landline, still hanging on the wall like it was 1995. And Mom reached for it out of habit. only to hesitate when the caller ID read unknown. She let it go to voicemail, and we both sat in silence as the machine picked up and a man's voice, calm and slow, said, "Mrs. Martin, this is a courtesy call to remind you that some family matters are best handled privately. We trust you'll make the right decision." The line went dead. No name, no company, just that message, floating in the space between us like a grenade with the pin already pulled. That's when it all shifted. Not just the mood, but the direction of everything. Mom's face hardened, the same way it did when she used to fight with Dad in hushed tones after dinner about money or vacations, or whether Emily should have been allowed to quit swim team. She stood up, closed the folder, and looked at me like I had just handed her a bomb. "You need to stop this," she said, not as a suggestion, but as a command. "You don't know what you're playing with." I laughed, quietly, bitterly, because it was absurd to hear her talk like that. Like I was the one endangering the family. Like I hadn't spent years being shoved into the background while Emily got everything, including protection from consequences. I told her the only thing I could say at that point, which was the truth. If she wanted to ignore this, to sweep it under the rug like everything else, she could. But I wasn't going to be part of it. I wasn't going to carry the weight of her delusion anymore. And if that meant being the villain in her eyes, then so be it. I picked up the folder, tucked it under my arm, and walked out without another word, because I knew nothing I could say would reach her, not yet. Later that night, I received an email from a burner address. No subject, no text, just an attachment. It was a screenshot of a wire transfer made from an account under Emily's name to a numbered account in the Cayman Islands. The amount was high, over $75,000, and the memo line simply read, "consulting fee." I didn't know what it meant, not exactly, but I knew enough to understand that Emily wasn't just skirting taxes or hiding money. She was part of something much more organized, much more dangerous. I printed the email and added it to the growing pile in my drawer. I thought about calling the friend who had helped me before, but something told me that was no longer a safe option. Whatever this was, it was bigger than I'd imagined, and the people involved were starting to notice me more than I was comfortable with. That night, I installed a security camera by my front door and moved the folder into a locked safe in my closet. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't even write it down. Emily finally called 2 days later. No pretense, no fake warmth, just her voice, cold and sharp, like a blade. "I know what you're doing," she said. "You think you're going to bring me down, but you don't understand what's at stake." I told her I didn't care. She laughed, a short, humorless sound. "You should, because if I go down, I'm not going alone." And that, more than anything, told me everything I needed to know. The golden daughter wasn't just tarnished. She was toxic, and she'd been counting on all of us being too loyal or too scared to expose her. But I wasn't either of those things anymore, not even close. It was a gray Thursday afternoon, the kind that feels too still to trust, with the sky hanging low like a warning and the air thick enough to make every breath feel like a negotiation, when I found myself standing in the foyer of the firm where Emily worked, the kind of sleek marble-floored financial palace filled with people who wore ambition like cologne and looked at you as though everything they needed to know about you could be deduced from the brand of your shoes and the type of bag slung over your shoulder. I hadn't planned on confronting her here, in the belly of the beast she called home, but after the call, the one where she said I didn't understand what was at stake, where she implied that I wasn't just risking her downfall, but potentially setting fire to things I didn't even know I was touching, I realized something critical. She was more afraid of me going public than I had initially understood, and that fear meant leverage I hadn't fully explored. When the receptionist asked if I had an appointment, I smiled in that tight corporate way I'd picked up from years of observing women like Emily charm their way through boardrooms and bridal showers alike, and I said, "Just tell her it's Kelly," before sitting down in one of those uncomfortable designer lobby chairs that looked expensive but felt like a punishment. I waited, patient and composed, and when Emily finally appeared in the glass doorway, her heels clicking with every step, her eyes scanning the lobby like she couldn't quite believe I dared to breach her carefully constructed sanctuary. I stood calm and silent and followed her into a side conference room without being asked. She closed the door behind us and didn't offer me a seat, which I didn't take as an insult, but as a confirmation that she was off balance, unsure of what was about to happen, and maybe even a little scared that whatever I had in that envelope I was holding might be something she couldn't talk her way around. "If this is about Mom," she began, her voice sharp and clipped like she was trying to set the tone before I could speak, "then save it. She's choosing to stay out of this, and frankly, that's smart. You should take the hint." I laid the envelope on the glass table between us and watched her face as she debated internally whether to touch it, open it, or pretend it wasn't there. "I'm not here to ask for anything," I said, and the steadiness in my voice surprised even me. "Not an apology, not an explanation, not even the truth. I just thought you should see what I'm planning to give the journalist who emailed me yesterday." That got her attention. She looked up fast, too fast to be subtle, and suddenly the facade cracked just enough to let something else peek through, something less rehearsed, less polished. "You wouldn't," she said, but her voice didn't carry conviction. "This is family, Kelly. You don't burn down your own house just to prove a point." And that's when I realized the final, most painful truth of all, that Emily genuinely believed that what she had built, this empire of manipulation and carefully managed lies, was something worth preserving, that the reputation she had constructed on foundations of fraud and favor trading was not just her own, but somehow ours, and that any attempt to challenge it was an act of betrayal, not justice. "You're right," I said after a long pause. "You don't burn down your own house, but you do take a match to the rot if you want anything worth saving to stand a chance." She didn't open the envelope, not while I was there, but I could tell she wanted to, that the temptation to know just how much I had, how much I'd pieced together, was battling with her need to stay in control. I left without another word, not because I'd won, but because I didn't need to fight anymore. The moment she called me a threat, the moment she realized I had something she couldn't spin, I knew I had shifted the balance of power. It was no longer about her lies. It was about my choice. The article didn't come out, not immediately. I never even replied to the journalist, not directly. Instead, I made copies of everything and sent them in anonymous envelopes to the IRS and a local news outlet, known for taking down big names when no one else would. I didn't need credit. I didn't need to be the face of the fallout. I just needed the truth to breathe. Mom didn't speak to me for a month after that. Not because she didn't believe me, she did deep down, but because admitting it out loud meant acknowledging that she had picked the wrong daughter to idolize, had poured years of affection and hope into someone who had turned it all into leverage. When we finally did talk, it was at her kitchen table again, a pot of coffee between us, and more silence than words. She didn't apologize, and I didn't expect her to. She simply said, "I didn't know," and I said, "You didn't want to." As for Emily, she resigned from the firm 2 weeks later, citing personal reasons. Her social media went dark. I heard through someone, one of those distant family members who always knows more than they should, that she was taking time to focus on herself, which I suppose is code for waiting to see if indictments are coming. I don't know where she is now, and honestly, I'm not sure I care. What mattered wasn't punishing her, though that was certainly part of it. What mattered was proving, if only to myself, that I didn't have to play the part they'd assigned me, that being the overlooked sister didn't mean being powerless, and that truth, even when it comes late, still has teeth. The last thing I did before putting everything to rest, before finally locking away the folders, deleting the backups, and turning off the mental reel of what-ifs that had looped endlessly for weeks, was write a letter to myself. Just a short one, a reminder that silence isn't virtue, and that being the quiet one, the accommodating one, doesn't mean you can't also be the one who changes everything. Because sometimes all it takes is one match, and the courage to strike it.